All right, I want to welcome everyone joining us tonight for Mid-Century Times That Made Paul McCobb. I'm Andrew Gustafson. This is the Johnson County Museum. Tonight we'll be hearing from Professor Peggy Honey. She's an associate professor in the Department of Interior Design and Fashion Studies at Kansas State University, where she's taught for 18 years. As faculty in K-State's highly ranked interior design program, she enjoys working with students in studio courses, as well as teaching the history of architecture, interiors, furniture, and furnishings. Professor Honey regularly takes students to Italy, France, and England, where they can experience design history in person. So please help us welcome Professor Peggy Honey. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Can everybody see my screen okay? Right? You're seeing the share. All right. Okay, so good evening, and I want to thank you for joining me as we talk about this really remarkable moment in time that was the mid-20th century. So I don't really consider myself a true historian, nor am I an expert on Paul McCobb, but so I think of myself instead as more of an observer of the intersection between history and design. And I love to see how they impact each other. So I'm hoping to share some of my observations with you this evening, and maybe you'll find them interesting too. I hope so. So my first few slides are a little heavy in text as I set the stage and define some of the terms for where I'm headed. And then we'll get into the pretty stuff, the visuals. So whether we're talking about architecture or interiors or furniture or any other kind of material culture, design is a product of the time. And design is really client related. It's client dependent. It relies on users who have needs and wants to choose the things that get designed. So whenever I teach about the history of architecture, interiors, and furnishings, I always tell my students that there are sort of three frameworks I want them to use to sort of help them understand design better. So you begin to understand why things look the way they do. So here are those three frameworks that I'm talking about. And the first is this idea of zeitgeist. I don't know how familiar many of you are with that term, but it actually comes from a German word, Zeit meaning time and Geist meaning spirit or ghost. Merriam-Webster says it's the general intellectual, moral, and cultural climate. But when we're talking about material artifacts like a house or a piece of furniture, I think you really have to add to that the sort of the economics of the time or the technologies that are available. Or even the materials that are available to be used to make things. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Now, all three of these are sort of interrelated, interdependent with each other. There's not really a clean line between them. But the next one I want to talk about is this idea of meaning. And meaning is a really interesting idiosyncratic thing because we all hold meaning in a different way. We choose things because they have meaning to us. The houses, the furniture, the art, those kinds of things, we choose things that are meaningful to us. And sometimes those meanings can be pretty shallow, like they're just, I like the style or I like the trend. But other times those meanings can be really deep. Like this house has been in my family for generations, or, this piece of furniture is the bed where my grandmother died. I mean, sometimes we have these really deep meanings and associations with things. And designers like to design pieces that people can have an association with and enjoy in a sort of a personal way. Then this third lens looking through is this idea of precedent. And design doesn't happen in a vacuum. As I said, it's client dependent, but it's also dependent upon the zeitgeist and what's happening around it. Good designers, great designers like Paul McCobb, really draw inspiration from previous sources. They may look at previous sources and say, I don't want to do that. Or they may say, oh, I could tweak that. I could do something just a little bit different. So as I go through what I have to say, I'll sort of talk about these in an intertwining way. So let's talk about, the zeitgeist of the middle of the 20th century. These are sort of the things that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail that influenced what design looked like. So as we continue, I want to start by talking about this, sort of defining what modernism is. Because the word modern is sometimes a really tricky thing to understand, even today, because we often use the word to mean it's contemporary or of this current time. But when we talk about modernism, like the noun modernism, we're really talking about a style of design of houses, of interiors, of furnishings, much in the same way that we talk about the Art Deco style and the arts and crafts style. But to the designers of the time, they were searching for something that best suited the emerging modern America. So they were using modern as an adjective, right? Modern America of the mid 20th century. And this time that design became known as modern design to those who were living in that time period, as it is to us now later. So Edgar Kaufman Jr. Wrote a treatise on the 12 principles of modernism. Now, Edgar Kaufman Jr. was an architectural student of Frank Lloyd Wright's. And in fact, his father was the man for whom Frank Lloyd Wright built Falling Water. And he went on to be a very respected architectural historian. And in 1950, he wrote for the Museum of Modern Art, this sort of summarized the principles of what modernism was. And I haven't listed all 12 of them out. I just sort of kind of grouped them together and summarized them. But when we talk about modern design, we're talking about design where the purpose of the object, whether that's a home or a piece of furniture or a kitchen utensil, the purpose ought to be very clear, very honest, readily available just looking at it. And that means that the construction should be very simple without any additional ornament. We are not talking about Eiffel Tower salt and pepper shakers here. We're talking about things that are very clean and have no excess ornamentation. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the phrase of form follows function, and that was coined by Louis Sullivan back in the 1800s. But to the modernist, it's more than form even following function. It's this marriage of form and function together. So you blend the use of an object with the materials that you use, the process that you may use to make it. Those things all are married together in modern design. One of the things that's really important to understand about the modernist movement is there was a very strong social agenda, sort of a social compact that the designers believed was important. They really felt that meeting the needs of the masses was as an important of a challenge as meeting the needs of the wealthy. They really wanted design to serve more people, and that they needed to come up with new materials and new techniques in order to be able to do that. So it's a really interesting sort of design for everyone, for all. And it was dramatically different from what had happened before, and it very much impacted what happened later. One point that I want to make is that modernism did exist side by side other styles. For example, the neo-colonial style of house was also very popular at the same time. So it wasn't the only thing happening, but it certainly was a very powerful and influential design of the time. So I want to just give us a little bit of precedent. What was happening before this time? So ever since the Renaissance, so 500 years earlier, every subsequential architectural, interiors, furniture style were basically variations on the classical theme. And this was true even in America, because the colonists brought with them to America the styles that they knew from their homeland. So we have this, classicism, always sort of just recycling. When we get to the 19th century and we have the Victorian age, we do begin to see more commercialism, more mass manufacturing of objects that still reflected the past. So we have new technologies, but we use them in ways where we can create for the masses styles that have happened in the past, like you see here, Gothic, Turkish, and they were all happening all at the same time, right? A slight departure in the Victorian age was the East Lake design, which is a little bit simpler, a little bit less historical reference. But in the 19th century, there were some exceptions to this. And I hope that most of you have been to the McCobb exhibit to see, and if so, you recognize the influence of the Windsor pieces of furniture in his design. So he was really influenced by what we would call these vernacular pieces, these Windsor pieces of furniture that would have been made by the common man, sometimes very skillfully crafted, but they weren't high style pieces. And then beyond that, in addition to that, I want to talk specifically about Shaker. And you saw in the McCobb exhibit a reference to Shaker as well. So this chair and the Shaker style existed side by side the Victorian age. So most people were buying Victorian pieces. And at the same time, the Shakers, this small group of individuals, was pushing back against what they saw, this rampant commercialism and poor quality and all of the things that they thought was, bad about design at the time. So they were creating these beautiful pieces of furniture, deliberately opposing what they saw happening in the world. So here are some great examples. And I want to point out that it isn't just a utilitarian. This furniture is beautiful. If you look at my number 12 little table up here, it's got gorgeous lines to it. It's a gorgeous piece of furniture. And the furniture is also multi-purpose. So here in the middle, we have a sewing chest, and it has like a yardstick along the side where you could measure out your furniture. So everything was very useful, very clean, but it emphasizes this gorgeous graining of wood, beautiful proportions and line. Another thing that the Shakers did was they implemented a lot of built-in furniture. So if you imagine up until this time, most storage pieces were, great big armoires and things like that. The Shakers built their storage in and then had the furniture pieces separate from that. They had fewer pieces of furniture in a room than the Victorians did. And I want to leave on this last piece, because I think if you didn't know this was a Shaker piece, you might think it was a modern piece, because it's just so clean and elegant, multi-purpose. The emphasis is on these flat planes and this beautiful wood graining. Another thing that is important to remember as we look at the built-ins is, prior to the mid 20th century, kitchens were did not have built-in cabinetry. They were sort of random pieces of furniture. A table became your cutting board, and a hutch was where you stored all of your food. So it is in the mid-century where, influenced by some of these precedents before, that we start to have kitchens be built in with cabinets as part of that, and appliances inserted into those cabinets. So 20th century dawns, and as happens as we begin any new century, we have this sort of, it's time for a new way of thinking. It's time for a new age. And that certainly was the case at the beginning of the 20th century. In Europe, you have designers who were beginning to reject anything that was classical. They weren't necessarily opposed to ornamentation, but they began to simplify decoration and use more abstract forms, or they would reference forms that were found in nature. These are all sort of Art Nouveau pieces. And the Art Nouveau style never really gained a great deal of traction here in the United States. Popular at the same time in the United States was the arts and crafts movement, the craftsman movement. And Gustav Stickley was the main proponent and had a magazine called the Craftsman Magazine. And Stickley felt that the Victorian age of excessive decoration and ornamentation didn't have a place in the new century. He, much like the Shakers, liked furniture that was built into the walls as well. He espoused furniture that suited the place it had to occupy and the work it had to do. And his furniture was known as mission furniture because it fulfilled this mission. It had a job to do and it did it. So as you look at mission style furniture, the arts and crafts movement, both in the US and in England, tended to look backwards towards medievalism. In England, though, they were all about handcraft, whereas in America, they were willing to exploit mechanization to be able to create furniture for the masses. But you can still see that the furniture is pretty clunky and heavy and perhaps looking backwards, especially when you look at this piece of Stickley furniture with its hardware that, those are really medieval strap hinges and medieval looking hardware. So the real break, when everything changes, came in the 1920s with the foundation of the Bauhaus in Germany. A lot of the ideas and methods that were developed at the Bauhaus are still impacting the way that design is done and the way that design is taught in schools today. So it was based on a model of collaboration through multiple disciplines. And the Bauhaus really believed that they needed to develop and exploit new materials like concrete and large plates of sheet glass, chrome, other kinds of metals. And so they came up with something completely different. They broke away finally from the pull of past styles and the structural traditions. So the Bauhaus began in 1919, and it was led by Walter Gropius from 1919 till 1928, and then Mies van der Rohe took over and led the Bauhaus until 1932. Now, the Bauhaus was never really very financially successful during its time, but its influence dramatically impacted design throughout the rest of the world. And part of that is, and one of the reasons that I mentioned those two people in particular, is that in the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism in Germany, the leaders and the artists of the Bauhaus, many were forced to immigrate. And so Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer went to Yale, where they designed and also taught. And then Mies van der Rohe went to Chicago, where his design became iconic, and he taught there as well. So these brilliant, forward-thinking people were now in the United States teaching the next generation of designers, as well as Eliel Saarinen, the great Finnish designer who was teaching at Cranbrook. So you have these brilliant, forward-looking designers teaching the next generation, which of course included people like Paul McCobb. So before we leave this, I do want to just show you these because I just think it's remarkable. These pieces of furniture are nearly 100 years old. In my mind, they look contemporary even for today. Breuer was really experimenting with this tubular chrome and its properties. And you have these beautiful pieces of furniture. And then you have Mies van der Rohe's iconic furniture that's still highly sought after. In fact, I just received an email from Knoll International, the furniture company, and they had a story about an NBA player whose name I can't remember, but he was sitting at his Eero Saarinen dining table on Mies van der Rohe Brno chairs. So very much in use today and sought after as really high style pieces. So we can't just skip from the Bauhaus to modernism without sort of briefly tipping our caps to the 1930s high style of Art Deco. Art Deco was a very decorative deco style, but it didn't hark back to classicism. In its ornamentation were other things, often geometric and very dynamic, like you see here on the Chrysler building. But I want to point out this little Greyhound bus terminal in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's an example of how the Art Moderne style really did spread across the United States. It wasn't very popular in Europe. It was mostly an American style, and it celebrated things like the new technologies. It was all about fast cars, fast buses, airplanes, all of those kinds of things were celebrated by the Art Moderne style. And of course, here in the Kansas City area, we have some great examples of Art Deco. And so I wanted to include this image of the Kansas City Municipal Auditorium, which actually opened during the mid-1930s. And it has some characteristics of both the Art Deco and the Art Moderne style. But the reality is that due to all of the other dominating concerns, such as the Depression and the rise of oppression in Europe that eventually led to war, Americans were forced to turn our efforts to dealing with these more critical issues, using new technologies, creative design, and resources to deal with these much more essential issues. So at this point, we are getting to that mid-century time frame where the United States begins to emerge from the Depression and World War II. But both of these events, the Depression and World War II, are really important motivators for the new design, for the new way of thinking. There are so many needs that need to be met. Not the least of these was the need for adequate and affordable housing. During the Depression, up to a third of the population of the United States was ill-housed. That's just crazy to think about. But during the Depression, with the instigation of the Housing Acts of 1934 and 1937, home ownership began to be possible for everyone, not just the wealthy. Imagine before this time, people had to be able to almost buy a house outright. You had to come up with all the money or borrow it from your family or something. It wasn't until this time with the FHA and the VA that we began to have longer mortgages that allowed people to pay a portion every month for a long period of time and to have less money up front. So this was really key in pushing forward this housing boom. So we have 10 million military personnel returning from World War II. We have millions of women who have been in the workforce that are now coming home as the military come back and fill their jobs. Because of the war, we have a very highly efficient war machine that is just ready and waiting to turn its expertise to more commercial ventures. So, prior to this time, the single family dwelling as the most prominent type of domestic living was really not universally obtainable. But the United States at this point was land rich, and it had a growing infrastructure of highways that connected workplaces. Before, people had moved, like in the Industrial Revolution, people moved to where the jobs were, right? But after World War II, because of our infrastructure of highways, we were beginning to connect people's homes, suburban or suburban homes, with their jobs in the cities. The other thing is that the United States had escaped really significant physical damage in World War II, unlike Europe. So we were in a much better position to be able to convert the war-developed industries. Americans were really quite proud. There was this feeling of being proud of what they had accomplished, coming out of the Depression, coming out of and conquering in World War II. Americans had a confidence in their future, and they began to look forward to having a piece of the American dream and having a choice about what that American dream looked like for them. So here in the middle of the 20th century, we have this very, very unique moment in time. There are these huge needs, but we also have the talent and the resources to address those needs. And as I mentioned before, there is this social responsibility that is part of how the designers feel about meeting these needs. And I love this Eames quote, and Andrew, you use this in your exhibit of McCobb, and he says, Charles Eames says, to bring the most of the best to the greatest number of people for the least. That's really what these designers were trying to do. And as a people, Americans were still pretty frugal. They had lived through the Depression. You probably had parents and grandparents who continued to collect all of their aluminum foil and their plastic bags and reuse everything that they possibly could. That was the mentality of the time. They had not yet adopted that bigger is better, mentality that follows. So here's another idea that I want to introduce that I think is really important to understand. And that is that whenever there is inequality in a society, and that's all the time, right? We always have those who are wealthy and those who have less. There's always been this tension about what good design is and who determines what good design is. There are the aesthetes, the educated ones, and there's sometimes this resistance. I don't want you telling me what I should like or what I should want. So there is this tension between high design and vernacular design. And vernacular design really does fill a need and is profitable and is affordable. And sometimes good design can't turn its wheels fast enough to serve the masses in the same way. But I do want to talk about some of that high design while we have a minute. And one of the most interesting things that I think happened during this time was this idea of the case study houses. Some of you might be familiar with this. John Intenza, who's the man on the right here, was the editor and owner, I think, of Arts and Architecture magazine, which was pretty much a California magazine. And he had this idea of creating a sort of a competition, and he invited 9 architects. Some were young, some were more established, and he invited them to design the ideal small house and with very few limitations on what they could do. He actually bought 5 acres of land in the Pacific Palisades overlooking the ocean, and they built the houses on that site. Included in that group of initial architects, this went on, there were other houses built in other sites as well, but in that initial group of architects were a young Charles Eames that you see here on the left, and his collaborator Eros Saarinen. And Eros Saarinen is the same person who designed the St. Louis Arch. Both Eames and Saarinen were trained at Cranbrook by Eros Saarinen's father. And Eames really became the rock star of the group. And some of the houses were never built. Some of them were just designed. But probably the most famous of the case houses was this one. It was Eames' own house, known as Case Study House number 8. You can see it's built quite early after the end of World War II. These case houses were wildly successful in introducing new technologies and affordability to sort of high design dwellings. So Eames basically built a house that was a lightweight steel and glass kind of cage. And he wasn't trained as an architect. He really is an industrial designer, much like Paul McCobb. He did a lot of different things. But he designed this house for himself and his wife, who was also a designer, Ray Eames. And he uses a lot of glass. He uses this really interesting solids versus voids kind of thing. He had a wonderful dramatic 2-story living space inside. You can see this big high ceiling with lots of light. It had no dining room, and unheard of at the time, it had 2 full bathrooms. Of course, the Eames filled this with all of the wonderful things that they designed. They designed toys, they made movies, they did all kinds of things, and they filled their house with all this interesting stuff. And I do want to point out here on the left, the Eames Lounge, which was probably Charles Eames' most successful design of anything that he did. You can still buy it now from Herman Miller for about $10,000. But it's a beautiful piece, iconic piece of furniture. So we also need to pay homage to Frank Lloyd Wright, who as early as the 1930s was experimenting with small single-story dwellings made for middle-income families. And he called these the Usonian homes. And typically these homes used materials that were native to the area where they were built. They had flat roofs. They often featured large cantilevered elements that would extend out from the house, so sort of shield it from direct sun. So they were some of the early predecessors of passive solar homes. They always featured open floor plans and high ceilings. And in 1953, Wright basically reconstructed an entire Usonian home in the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And those are the images that you're looking at here. You can see his use of high ceilings and wonderful built-ins, nice high clerestory lighting integrated into the walls themselves. When you look at Wright's furniture, like this dining room pieces back here, most of it's pretty clunky. It never really was very commercially successful for most people. You do see a couple of chairs here in the left-hand corner that, they could be McCobb chairs as you look at their lighter scale. Okay, so once again, though, so that's our good design side of this tension, right? But there's this real massive immediate need for housing. And so American industry jumped in and to meet the need and to make money in the process. So now we're going to turn to the sort of vernacular side of affordable housing for the millions. So here we are. This is a development by Levitt and Sons. They built a lot of houses in a number of different places. And they did this by making them easy to build. So when you build a house, building a basement is a difficult and expensive thing to do. So what they did is they poured concrete slabs, and all of these houses did not have basements. They were built on a slab. They actually had a factory out in California where they cut all of the lumber and everything to the exact precise sizes that they needed. They even machined the nails that they needed. And then they hired groups of individuals that they trained to work on a specific part of the house. So it was almost assembly line housing building. They could build 30 houses a day by 1948. And these were small homes, only 750 square feet. So that's about the size of maybe a 1-bedroom apartment in today's market. They would put a second floor on that, which would double the size. But this had some really important things. It had those built-in kitchens, those cabinetry, those cabinets with appliances included and built in. And they would often give away televisions to the people who bought the houses. So by 1951, they had built over 17,000 houses. Now, unfortunately, we know that there was a lot of discrimination, racial discrimination that went along with Levittowns, but they were really important in meeting the need of housing. So these are some images of the different types of houses that were available through Levittown. And you can see that they're pretty traditional looking. Down here on the bottom, we are looking at little neo-colonial houses. On the top, we have like a Cape Cod, and here in the middle, we have sort of a California ranch. So these would be called mid-century houses, but they're not modern. So those of you who have lived in older homes, or maybe you grew up in one of these homes, knows that typically they only just had one bathroom. Even if you had 4 or 5 bedrooms, you still only had one bathroom. These homes typically did not have both a living room and a family room. They rarely had a separate dining room. And the idea of an ensuite bathroom was still fairly rare. But it's important to see these because these were the types of homes for which Paul McCobb was designing furniture. His planner group, it was made for these kinds of small, simple homes that needed smaller, lightweight scaled furniture that was very flexible and served multiple functions. So just for fun, how do those Levittown houses compare? So I went online and I found a fairly modest house, 1,600 square feet from the Drummond House Plans website. I just kind of randomly chose them. And you can see the plan and it's pretty concisely designed. Oh, by the way, the Levittown houses, I mean, garages were not included. They had a carport, perhaps. But this is the footprint of a Levittown house. So you can see how much smaller they were. But then when you compare that with a 3,000 square foot house, like you might see easily built today, you get a real sense that these were still pretty simple little, houses. These were frugal houses. I also wanted to show, I have this book called American Shelter by Lester Walter, and I really like it because he has pinned down some of the most popular house styles of the era. So what he's illustrating here are common contractor vernacular versions of modern houses. He even calls them contractor modern. And I'm sure that you'll recognize a lot of these houses from neighborhoods near you. And I apologize that it's a little bit pixelated, but I was scanning little tiny images. The unfortunate thing is that not all contractor built houses were even this nice, right? Sometimes the result was affordable houses that had almost no design interest or design integrity. So there again, we have that tension between contractor built and architecture designed houses. This is really interesting. I don't know if you can see the detail here, but in 1953, Life magazine gathered together some of the best contractors in the nation and had them design a good-looking, skillfully engineered $15,000 house. And this house was called the Trade Secrets House because it applied assembly line techniques that had been held secret for years. One of those is that roof truss, that triangular roof truss that you see there. This house, published by Life magazine in 1953, was really highly influential in the vernacular contract modern movement of house building. I just want to show a couple of others of these. Here we have from the mid-50s, a California ranch house that was often used and sort of evolved into a much seen version of the contractor modern. And finally, here we have a much larger 4-bedroom contractor modern house. Now, this house is about 2,500 square feet and would no longer have been really a low-cost option. And And it's important to remember that neo-colonial houses were also popular at this time. And often those houses were interpreted as being more educated representations of good taste, because many of the contractor built homes were ill proportioned and overly simplified and sometimes just downright ugly. So right now I actually live in a post-World War II subdivision here in Manhattan, Kansas. And within our neighborhood, we have a real mix of some of these ugly, plain Jane contractor houses. We have some neo-colonial houses, and we even have a number of more sophisticated sort of high-style architect designed homes. And they're all existing. That's why I love my neighborhood. The charm of my neighborhood is that these houses are all coexisting with each other within the same neighborhood. So now I would like to turn finally to furniture design and examine the wide range of options that were available to the American public. So we've already talked about the fact that we have a number of young designers who are well trained and they understand the technical needs of what you need to do to create well-built furniture. And most of them are doing that without reference to traditional styles. Most of them, like a Paul McCobb or a Charles Eames, are really designing lots of different things, everything from furniture to ceramic ware to textiles. And you've seen those things that McCobb designed in the exhibit. So it's absolutely true that well-designed modern furniture really did enjoy a great deal of acceptance due to its simplicity and affordability. It did exist side by side. There were more traditional Queen Anne and Chippendale and all of those kinds of pieces of furniture being sold as well. But its flexibility and the scale of it made it really a natural fit for the smaller homes of the day. So here are some of those really talented designers, and the list is quite impressive. The legacies of these people up on the top here, the Eames, the Sarnans, Nelson, Knoll, Gerard, their legacy really was continued and promoted by the companies for whom they designed. We had Florence Knoll leading Knoll International, and she brought Eero Saarinen and Mies van der Rohe under the Knoll International wing. George Nelson led Herman Miller and brought Charles and Ray Eames there. Paul McCobb was less known, and why? Probably because he died young and his company died as he died. There was no one there sort of cheering on his legacy. And it may even be in the McCobb exhibit where they talk a little bit about this, that he wasn't an easy person to get along with. And so there weren't a lot of people championing his work upon his death. I wanted to show you some of the great work that was being done. And here you see the variety and the versatility of the design work. Here's George Nelson and some of his work. You probably recognize that bald wall clock, this iconic piece. Here are some pieces by Charles Eames. And here you can see that he's experimenting with bent plywood, with fiberglass, with other types of plastic. But as you look at this, he's always trying to make pieces of furniture that fit the human form in a comfortable way. And that's part of that social compact that I was talking about, their desire to create these pieces of furniture that a lot of people could use comfortably. Here's some of his storage units. They bear a little bit of similarity with some of the McCobb storage pieces. Here is a case piece designed by Florence Knoll. Now, Florence Knoll didn't consider herself really to be a designer. She had all of these other designers who designed beautiful furniture. She would design the pieces in between, the other things that you needed to fill out a room. So here you see this case piece, wall-mounted case piece. She also brought in some of the Scandinavian designers, whom we didn't have time to talk about them, but they were really influential as well. Here's Eero Saarinen. So Eero Saarinen, like Paul McCobb, died young at the age of 52. And his work is so iconic, and it just makes you wonder what could have been produced by both of these men had they lived longer lives, because their work continues to be so admired. And then I wanted to also show, these are Alexander Gerard textile designs, and they are actually currently available from Meharem Textiles. But here you recognize sort of the aesthetic of the time. Paul McCobb's ceramic ware and textiles that he designed had very similar, characteristics that you see here. So let's look at Paul McCobb's pieces. He may be less known than many of his contemporaries, but he clearly was not second to them in his vision and his talent. His work is really beautifully proportioned and beautifully constructed. Even his less expensive pieces, his early planner group, were meant to be usable for a long period of time. And as I look at his work and read more about him, I see his really skillful use of precedent from vernacular styles such as the Windsor and the Shaker. He doesn't copy them, he updates them and makes them relevant for his time. But I think that that's kind of what makes his furniture pieces so approachable. They don't feel completely unknown. They feel like something we're friends with, something that's compatible in both a high style and a vernacular style, sort of mid-century house. So in these next few slides, you might find it interesting. So on the left, I have some images that I took off of an auction website that's Wright. And Wright has auctioned a number of McCobb's pieces. In fact, in 2017, they had an entire auction dedicated to Paul McCobb. But I just wanted to point out these what these items sold for in auction. So 5 years ago, this dresser sold for nearly $6,000. And I think you can see its reference to the Shaker pretty clearly. Here we have a couple of his chairs that really use the beautiful spindles of the Windsor chair. And even to the point, the Windsor chairs had these molded seats, these formed seats that were meant to be comfortable to sit in, and they had these curved backs that were comfortable. And you see that in McCobb's chairs as well. This is from his linear group. And when these 4 chairs were originally sold, they sold for $200. And they were auctioned for 4 times that amount. But I think you can see some precedent here. Looking at a Duncan Fife Empire piece with that lovely curved back, and even the shape at the top of the back of this chair sort of tips its hat to this American colonial ladderback chair. I haven't talked much about the Scandinavians, but Finuel, one of the great Scandinavian designers, obviously the American designers were influenced by the Scandinavians and vice versa. Here are a couple of McCobb chairs that sold for $2,000 back in 2017. This one is the one that blew me away. This is a single chair that I guess is quite rare on this spider base that you see here, experimenting with fiberglass and plastics. And it sold for auction for $3,600 back in 2017. But I wanted to pair it to the side of these sort of experimental chairs designed by Charles Eames and George Nelson. They were all experimenting with new materials, but always with the human comfort in mind. So, McCobb's legacy is increasing today, and I think we'll see more of that happening as museums like the Johnson County Museum, are recognizing his genius and honoring his work. And his pieces are really well sought after by collectors. My friend who's a collector himself says that the market perhaps the mid-century modern market has plateaued just a little bit, but these pieces are still highly sought after, particularly by younger generations that are choosing to live in smaller urban environments or smaller, suburban environments. Interestingly enough, some of his work is being re-released. Crate and Barrel's high style brand that's known as CB2 now has a collection of McCobb's outdoor furniture and a few of his light fixtures. And I love how they talk about it. They say, one of the leading voices in American mid-century design, Paul McCobb reveals the sexiness inherent in simplicity, the enduring cool that is editing down form and line. And I'm not sure McCobb was looking for sexiness when he designed these simple forms, but I guess at $499 each, they're pretty sexy. And then I wanted to show this other article that I tracked down from the New York Times, where the author took a couple of his friends and they went looking for Paul McCobb furniture, and they found these two pieces. These are two planner nightstands that sold as a set for $30 back when they were originally made. And they were in a vintage furniture store being sold for $8,800. So that's quite a difference. But one of the reasons I wanted to include this is that the author makes the point that the beautifully machine crafted dovetail joints and this, the beautiful wood species, even the metal, it could just never be afforded today. This really was this unique moment in time where good design and affordability could match. So now this is what we have. Here is the state of affordable modernism today. I would love to know what Charles Eames would think about this. I mean, we are certainly not getting the most of the best, but perhaps we are still reaching the greatest number of people for the least, whether you're at Target or IKEA, that modernist ideal still continues. Whew, made it through. I have all of these attributions which you don't care about, but just know that all of those photographs were attributed. So, Andrew, I am done, and I'm happy to take any questions if people are still with me. I took a little longer than I wanted to.
Oh, no, that was wonderful. I'd love to take a class with you someday. Very, very interesting stuff. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your thoroughness with this. I think it was really interesting to see the buildup of how we get to McCobb's era. Yeah, if you have questions, folks, throw them in the chat and I'll read them out. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions. I had a question. I just wanted to verify, is Art Moderne the same as International? That building looks so similar. They're different. Okay.
Yeah, they are different. The International style is actually a little earlier, kind of comes out more of Bauhaus. So Art Moderne has some of the characteristics of the International style with the flat roofs and the clean lines, but it's still much more decorative than the International style would have been. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I'll start. So this is sort of a half-formed question as we're waiting for questions in the chat. So forgive me. And I know, so you mentioned your own neighborhood, and I'm thinking about, things that a lot of choice involved, people choosing what they preferred, styles that spoke to them. Do you think people's income levels at the time, or even maybe their location, the region in the country they lived, or circumstances, do you think that influenced their choices at all in terms of home design or interior?
Yes, I'm sure. And, I just ran out of time to be able to include everything that I wanted to. But one of the things that I did is I went back into the archives of books and magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and House Beautiful and all of those things. And there's no doubt that as we came out of World War II, consumerism just took off. So the influence of magazine ads, and most of them were, you've seen those ads, I think, from that time period. Wealthy white people looking dressed well, sitting in their houses, and but there were so many choices, and certainly they were, women were reading those magazines. I actually have a book. This book. This book was my mother's book. She bought it in 1954, and she and my father built a house right around this same time period. And, I could see in my mother this, carefully looking at what was good design and implementing that in her new home. So yes, so much influence, and where you lived and what you saw your neighbor doing and what was available and what you saw in the ads, all of those things, would definitely have impacted you. And Aletha, you talk about, can you tell us a little bit about McCobb's decorative arts, like his china and teapots? I bet Andrew could tell us more about those than I can, but they really are indicative of this idea of industrial design as opposed to being a furniture designer or they saw design as solving a problem in a really nice way. And it didn't matter what that problem was. If that problem was stemware, if that problem was, flatware, if that problem was textiles, all of those things, a good designer could solve any problem. And so you see his beautiful decorative pieces as well. I don't know a whole lot more about them specifically. Sam, you probably know. Sam's
is Sam Hildreth? Is Sam Hildreth here tonight?
Sam.
I am here. I am present.
Here's the true collector. He knows about it.
So the china is interesting. It started out with only 2 patterns originally, but every year they were releasing new patterns to keep up with the trend of the day. And even late in the China's run, they made another line that was even more traditional in style, and to harken back to the other revival styles that were popular of that time. And so while McCobb was mostly into mid-century modernism, he wasn't always. Sometimes he adapted his styles to lend itself to other trends that were popular of the day.
That's a smart approach, come from a commercial standpoint. But I'm sure that he probably also did that with a great deal of sensitivity too. My guess is his more traditional things had a clarity of line and proportion. Would you say that, Sam?
I would, and they definitely did. And you can feel late in his career the struggle between his love of clean lines and mid-century modernism and the shifting markets in the 1960s, where they were starting to get away from mid-century modern, and McCobb was sort of trying to get his bearings and figure out where to go. In the 1950s, it was very clear what he liked, and it was in line with what the market liked. But as the trends changed, he sort of felt that pressure that of unsure of where he should go and how to adapt his designs for the changing markets.
And I think we could all agree that as we went into the 60s and got further into the 60s, we lost a lot of this, the attention to great proportion and fine detail. We started getting these weird chairs with high backs, and we started just doing things differently. And I can imagine for someone with the design sensitivities of Paul McCobb, that would be difficult to reconcile.
Yeah. And so I asked Sam this question in another program. And for those who don't know, Sam Hildreth is the collector of the Paul McCobb pieces that are on display in the Johnson County Museum's exhibit. And so I'll ask you this, Peggy, something like, do you think that the mid-century modern style is becoming popular again, or has become popular again, or has it always been popular since it came out?
No, I think there was definitely a period of time where it fell really out of favor. I think 25 years ago, you could have picked up an Eames shell chair for $5 sitting on the corner. People were just throwing them away, right? I I think that we have gone through this period of time, unfortunately, where bigger was better, more was more. Let's just, let's build bigger houses. Let's build bigger pieces of furniture. Let's return to Italian Renaissance revival. I mean, we went through this period of time where the mid-century modern stuff really did fall out of favor. There have always been a few of those little Scandinavian design stores and things that have kept going through all of that. And certainly some pieces like a Mies van der Rohe Brno chair or some of those pieces have maintained a level of appreciation. But I think generally right now, well, and in the last 15 years, we really have seen a resurgence of the style and a greater appreciation, a harking back to that. And not just in the design of the furniture, but in just the way that we are treating spaces differently now. Do you remember the 80s of the faux finishes and all of that stuff, And now we're getting a little bit back to, we don't need granite countertops. We can, there are better technologies that we can use. Those we're trying to adapt that, and part of that is this idea of limited resources. We need to find better solutions. I'm just curious who designed the chrome curved armless blonde cane seat and cane back chairs. Those are Marcel Breuer. Marcel Breuer was the great designer of those Cheska chairs. Everybody owned those, right? Those caned back and seats. Those were in every kitchen dinette set for a number of years. Those are all Marcel Breuer. And if you've ever sat in them, they're really interesting. They have a little give and you can get in and out of them easily. They're an interesting piece of furniture, but you do have waffle prints on your tush because they're caned bottom.
I'll put out a last call for questions here. We've reached a little past our hour, and so I want to be mindful of time. But I did want to ask, a question was messaged to me. You talked a little bit about marketing and how those ads are always sort of the American dream and the American ideal, and also very white. And so I'm curious if you happen to know how mid-century modern or any of that era designs and school of thought were marketed to non-white audiences, or were they?
No, they really weren't.
Hmm.
I mean, design was very much segregated during this era. And even today, as in design education, it's something that I'm trying to overcome. I'm going back into my design history lectures and trying to recapture a lot of things that I didn't ever learn. I never learned about the people of color who were great designers. But I would say yes, and that's to our detriment. But I do think that there were certainly mid-century neighborhoods that were segregated and similar to Levitt towns that were available to people of color. But when I looked through the ladies' home journals and the House Beautifuls, there was no representation of color anywhere. That was really striking.
I will say that McCobb was one of the few people who advertised in magazines like Jet, which was a predominantly African-American centric magazine of the time. And there were other Black or African-American people designing along with McCobb in some of the same companies that he designed for, like the fabric companies. But they were not ever really shown alongside them visually.
Oh, I'm really glad to know that he did that. Yeah, it's design has unfortunately followed the traditions of our other traditions that aren't necessarily healthy.
Sam, thanks for that bit. And
Yeah.
thanks, Peggy, for addressing that too. I appreciate that. So I didn't see any other questions come in. So Peggy, I'll ask this. I know you saw the Paul McCobb exhibit. What is your favorite piece in there?
It is that lovely lady's desk, that beautiful little lady's desk. Boy, I would just about give my eye teeth for that. That was just beautiful. No, there are some beautiful pieces throughout, and I loved seeing them in the electric house, seeing the dining room set and everything in that setting. And that, I think he did a great job of putting those all together. But boy, I just sat and drooled over the lovely lady's desk.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you. I have some announcements, but I want to turn off this recording. So let me do that quickly if I can find the button for it. Where's the button? There it is.